In the autumn of 1840, when the last golden leaves clung stubbornly to the ancient oaks of Ashcroft Manor and the first bitter winds whispered that Christmas was drawing near, there existed a silence so complete that even the crows seemed unwilling to disturb it. The sprawling ducal estate, once celebrated across England for its glowing halls, joyous choirs and magnificent Yuletide feasts, had become a place where winter arrived not with snow but with mourning. Travelers passing the towering iron gates often remarked that the manor looked less like a noble home than a grand mausoleum where laughter itself had been buried beneath cold stone. 6 years earlier, Christmas had stolen the woman who had filled those halls with warmth. Duchess Eleanor Ashcroft had vanished from the world during the season she cherished most, leaving behind a husband who never forgave December and 2 children too young to understand why happiness could disappear overnight. Since that dreadful year, Duke Alexander Ashcroft had forbidden every trace of the holiday. Evergreen wreaths no longer adorned the carved oak doors. The chapel choir had been dismissed. Candles remained boxed away in dusty cupboards. Even the great bell that had once welcomed Christmas morning hung silent above the estate, its rope untouched as though ringing it would awaken unbearable grief. The servants obeyed without question, yet sorrow lingered in every corridor. Elderly footmen who had once laughed while carrying towering Christmas puddings now lowered their voices whenever December approached. The kitchen staff prepared ordinary suppers instead of festive banquets. Stable boys avoided humming familiar carols for fear someone might hear. Every soul within Ashcroft Manor understood that joy had become the one thing forbidden beneath its roof. Alexander himself had changed almost beyond recognition. At 38, he remained every inch the commanding nobleman England admired. Tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed, with dark hair touched by the first threads of silver, but grief had carved invisible wounds across his face. His eyes, once known for quiet kindness, carried the constant weight of sleepless nights. He fulfilled every duty expected of a duke with flawless precision, yet nothing could persuade him to enter the grand ballroom where he had once danced with Eleanor beneath thousands of candle flames. Each evening, after the estate had settled into silence, he climbed alone to the locked music room. There he stood before his late wife's portrait until dawn threatened the windows, saying nothing, touching nothing, simply remembering. His son, 10-year-old Edmund, had inherited his father's steady gaze but not his guarded heart. Thoughtful beyond his years, the boy secretly visited the abandoned music room whenever he could. Hidden inside an old cabinet rested his mother's violin, damaged when it had fallen during the chaos following her death. Piece by piece, Edmund had begun repairing it himself with tiny tools borrowed from the estate carpenter, convinced that if the instrument could sing again, perhaps something inside his father might awaken as well. Little Lucy, only 7, remembered her mother differently. Time had blurred Eleanor's face in her memory, but not her voice. Every Christmas Eve after the servants retired, she quietly placed a tiny candle beneath her mother's portrait and whispered stories about school lessons, scraped knees and missing teeth, believing somehow that mothers in heaven still wished to hear ordinary things. She never told anyone she did this, though the melted wax found each December betrayed her small ritual. Among those who served the manor, there remained one woman who refused to surrender entirely to despair. Mrs. Beatrice Henshaw, the stern housekeeper, had once adored the Duchess like a daughter. Since Eleanor's death, however, kindness had hardened into relentless discipline. She believed constant work protected broken hearts from dangerous memories. Every servant under her authority labored without pause, especially newcomers who had yet to prove themselves worthy of remaining at Ashcroft Manor. It was beneath her watchful eye that Clara Whitmore first arrived. She appeared one rain-soaked afternoon carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and a faded wool cloak stitched too many times to count. 25 years old, Clara possessed neither fashionable beauty nor noble confidence. Long hours of hardship had left gentle weariness around her hazel eyes, yet there remained an unmistakable softness within her expression that no poverty could erase. Around her neck, tied by a weathered blue ribbon, hung a tiny silver bell dulled by age. She instinctively touched it whenever anxiety tightened around her heart. When Mrs. Henshaw demanded references, Clara admitted she had none. When asked whether she feared difficult labor, she quietly replied that honest work had never frightened her. The housekeeper studied her patched sleeves before assigning the most exhausting duties available. Clara accepted without hesitation. Before sunrise she scrubbed marble staircases stiff with frost. She hauled buckets through freezing courtyards. She fed restless horses while icy rain soaked through her boots. She polished windows until her fingers bled beneath rough cloths. Never once did she complain. The older servants noticed. Some admired her quiet determination. Others pitied her. The visiting nobility found amusement instead. Late one afternoon, several elegantly dressed ladies arrived to discuss winter charity plans with the Duke. As they crossed the courtyard, they paused beneath embroidered umbrellas to watch Clara sweeping rain-soaked leaves across the endless stone terrace. One woman laughed that the poor girl appeared to be sweeping England itself. Another deliberately kicked fresh leaves across the path Clara had already cleaned. A third allowed muddy water from her carriage wheels to splash across the young maid's apron. Clara merely lowered her eyes, wrung out the soaked broom, and began again. Hidden behind a column, Edmund clenched his fists. Lucy quietly slipped away and returned carrying the last warm roll from the kitchen. Pretending she had simply dropped it, she placed it near Clara's bucket before running off without a word. Clara looked after the child with grateful eyes but never called her back. Days passed. The autumn rain grew colder. The manor seemed quieter than ever. Then, on a gray afternoon when heavy clouds smothered every trace of sunlight, Clara found herself entirely alone in the vast courtyard. Leaves skated across the wet stone beneath the wind, and rain shimmered like silver threads against the ancient walls. Thinking no soul remained nearby, she rested both hands upon the broom and, almost without realizing it, began singing. It was not loud. It was barely more than a whisper. A gentle Christmas lullaby drifted into the rain, carrying notes so hauntingly familiar that time itself seemed to hesitate. Inside the manor, Alexander stopped breathing. Edmund dropped the violin bridge he had been carving. Lucy's candle slipped from her trembling fingers. Within moments, the great front doors burst open, and father and children ran across the rain-dark courtyard toward the astonished maid. Clara fell silent, horror flooding her face as the Duke stared not at her, but at the tiny silver bell trembling against her chest. Alexander stood motionless in the rain, his gloved hand suspended in the air as though one careless movement might shatter the impossible moment before him. Water streamed from the brim of his coat, yet he neither noticed nor cared. Edmund's breathing came in uneven gasps beside him, while little Lucy buried her face against her father's arm, her tiny fingers clutching the fabric so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Clara remained frozen where she stood, the broom slipping slowly from her trembling hands until it struck the wet stone with a hollow sound that echoed across the silent courtyard. No one spoke. The melody she had sung still seemed to linger in the cold air, haunting every corner of Ashcroft Manor. Finally Alexander found his voice. "Where did you learn that song?" His words carried neither anger nor accusation. They sounded fragile, as if spoken by a man afraid of hearing the answer. Clara swallowed hard. "From a woman." "What woman?" "I never knew her name." The Duke's eyes narrowed with desperate disbelief. No one else knew those words. "I promise," Clara whispered, "I have never met your wife." Lucy slowly stepped away from her father and approached Clara, tears shining on her cheeks. "My mama sang that every Christmas," she said softly. "Every single Christmas." Clara looked at the child with heartbreaking tenderness. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." Alexander carefully unclasped the silver bell hanging from Clara's faded ribbon. He examined its worn surface beneath the gray afternoon light. Tiny holly leaves had been engraved around its edge by an exceptionally skilled craftsman. Time had softened the silver, yet the design remained unmistakable. He had commissioned exactly 3 such bells 20 years earlier. One belonged to Eleanor. One had been gifted to the estate chapel. The third had mysteriously disappeared before Christmas the following year. His fingers tightened around it. "Where did you get this?" Clara hesitated only a moment. "It was given to me when I was 12. The rain continued falling as servants quietly gathered beneath the covered colonnades, sensing something extraordinary unfolding before them. Mrs. Henshaw stepped closer. "The Duke asked you a question." Clara lowered her eyes. "I'll answer." She drew a slow breath, her voice barely louder than the rain itself. "When I was 12, my father worked as a mail coach driver. We were traveling through Blackwood Forest just before Christmas. Snow had fallen for 2 days without stopping. Even the wind seemed to quiet itself. Our horses slipped crossing an icy bridge. The coach overturned into a ditch." She paused. "My father pushed me away before it rolled." A shadow crossed her face. "He never climbed out." Lucy instinctively reached for Clara's hand. Clara smiled faintly before continuing. "I was trapped beneath broken timber. My leg couldn't move. Night came. The snow kept falling. The gathered servants listened without breathing. I thought I would die before morning." Alexander could almost see the frightened child she had once been. "Hours passed. I stopped crying because I didn't have the strength anymore. Then someone found me. Her voice softened. I heard sleigh bells first. Then footsteps. A woman climbed down into the snow beside me. She wore a dark green traveling cloak trimmed with white fur. She should have continued home. Instead she sent her carriage away. Mrs. Henshaw's expression slowly changed. Clara continued. She wrapped me in her own cloak. She held my hand. She kept telling me stories about Christmas. When I began drifting to sleep, she started singing. Alexander closed his eyes. He already knew what came next. The same lullaby. Clara nodded. All night. Every time I became too weak to answer, she'd sing again. The song kept me awake. It kept me alive. Tears filled Lucy's eyes. Edmund stared silently at the ground. When dawn came, Clara whispered, villagers finally reached us. The woman smiled. She placed this silver bell into my hand. Alexander looked again at the tiny ornament resting in his palm. She said. Clara's voice trembled as she repeated words memorized for 13 long years. Whenever darkness tells you Christmas is gone. She looked toward the silent manor. Ring this. Her fingers unconsciously reached toward the missing bell. Hope always hears first. No one moved. Alexander felt the air leave his lungs. Those words. Only Eleanor had ever spoken them. She had written them every December inside children's Christmas books distributed to village orphanages. He had teased her for repeating the same sentence each year. She had only smiled and answered that hope deserved repeating. Mrs. Henshaw quietly covered her mouth. She remembered. Every Christmas morning Eleanor had carried baskets of food beyond the estate walls before attending church. She had insisted that lonely people deserved Christmas before the wealthy did. Alexander had believed those were merely acts of charity. Now he wondered how many strangers carried pieces of his wife's kindness without ever knowing her name. Clara looked around nervously. I never knew she was a duchess. I only remembered her voice. And the song. Alexander slowly returned the silver bell to her trembling hands. Keep it. She carefully retied the faded ribbon around her neck. I've never taken it off. I thought perhaps. She whispered, if I kept it close, I'd never become as hopeless as I was that night. For the first time since Eleanor's death, Alexander looked at another woman without comparing her to his wife. He saw no resemblance. Their faces were entirely different. Their voices differed. Their mannerisms were not alike. Yet the same quiet compassion seemed to live within them both. Not imitation. Character. The realization unsettled him more deeply than any ghost ever could. Word of the courtyard spread through the estate before sunset. By evening every servant whispered that the new maid knew the Duchess's Christmas song. Not everyone welcomed the miracle. When several noble ladies learned what had happened, cruel smiles replaced polite sympathy. One insisted the girl had invented the story to win the Duke's pity. Another declared no servant should dare sing a noblewoman's song. Lady Margaret Winthrop, whose ambitions to see her own niece marry Alexander had never disappeared, watched Clara with cold calculation. A grieving man, she remarked over tea, often mistakes coincidence for destiny. The following morning Clara discovered the small wooden box where she had placed the silver bell lying open inside the servants' quarters. The ribbon had been carelessly cut. The bell itself had been crushed beneath someone's heavy boot. Its delicate frame bent inward. Its tiny clapper broken. Clara simply gathered the damaged pieces into her apron. She did not accuse anyone. She did not cry. Later that afternoon she entered the abandoned music room to deliver fresh firewood. Scattered across the polished floor lay torn sheets from Eleanor's handwritten Christmas music book. Pages had been ripped apart and trampled into muddy footprints. Someone had deliberately destroyed them. Clara slowly knelt. One by one she gathered every ruined page. Outside the doorway, unseen by her, Edmund and Lucy silently watched. Neither child spoke. But both understood something they had never felt before. The woman protecting their mother's songs had never even known their mother's name. Christmas approached with quiet determination, not because Ashcroft Manor welcomed it, but because the season refused to be banished forever. Frost spread across the estate each morning like delicate lace, silvering the gardens and covering the sleeping fields beyond the stone walls. Smoke curled from distant village chimneys, and despite the Duke's long-standing decree, faint echoes of church bells drifted through the countryside whenever the wind changed direction. Alexander pretended not to hear them, yet something within him no longer demanded silence with the same relentless certainty. Life inside the manor had begun changing in ways too subtle for anyone to command and too powerful for anyone to stop. Servants who once hurried through endless duties now occasionally paused to exchange small smiles. Mrs. Henshaw still maintained strict discipline, but her voice no longer carried quite the same hardness whenever she addressed Clara. Even after the destruction of the silver bell and the desecration of Eleanor's treasured music, Clara continued her work with remarkable gentleness. She repaired broken furniture before anyone asked, mended children's torn coats late into the night, and quietly polished the Duchess's abandoned piano until its dark wood reflected candlelight once more. Alexander noticed every act. He never mentioned them. One icy dawn he watched from his study window as Clara crossed the courtyard carrying 2 heavy baskets toward the estate gates before sunrise. Curious, he followed at a distance without announcing himself. Outside the walls, nearly a dozen village children stood shivering beneath threadbare coats. Their cheeks were red from cold, and several wore boots patched so many times they scarcely resembled shoes at all. Clara greeted every child by name. She handed each one warm bread, thick vegetable soup, and fresh apples wrapped carefully inside cloth. Only after every child had eaten did she quietly sip the small cup of broth she had saved for herself. Alexander remained hidden among the trees. He understood then why Eleanor had loved serving others before serving herself. Not because kindness required wealth, because generosity began with the heart. That evening he instructed the kitchens to prepare twice as much food every day. No explanation followed. Mrs. Henshaw simply nodded. She understood. Within a week, Edmund insisted on helping distribute bread beside Clara. Lucy carried tiny knitted scarves she had secretly made using leftover wool from the sewing room. Before long, the Duke himself lifted heavy baskets onto waiting wagons without ceremony or announcement. The villagers never expected to see England's most reserved Duke serving soup beneath falling snow. Neither had he. Word spread quietly through neighboring villages that Ashcroft Manor had opened its gates once again, not for celebrations but for compassion. As Christmas market day arrived, the village square awakened with cautious hope. Wooden stalls overflowed with candles, carved toys, roasted chestnuts, ribbons, winter herbs, and steaming pastries. Musicians cautiously played cheerful melodies, uncertain whether the Duke's presence might silence them forever. Instead, Alexander merely listened while Edmund and Lucy wandered happily between decorated booths, their laughter sounding strangely unfamiliar after so many silent years. Clara remained close enough to watch the children but far enough to avoid attracting noble attention. Several aristocratic ladies observed her with thinly disguised contempt. Lady Margaret Winthrop smiled coldly as Clara passed. "How fortunate," she remarked loudly, "that some servants discover tragedy profitable." Clara neither answered nor slowed her steps. Alexander heard every word. For the first time he felt irritation rather than doubt. The market overlooked part of Ashcroft Forest, where the royal deer preserve stretched across rolling hills protected by ancient stone boundaries. Families often admired the graceful animals from a safe distance, especially during winter when the stags descended toward lower ground. Lucy spotted movement among the snow-covered trees. "Oh," she laughed. "The deer." Before anyone realized where she had gone, she slipped beneath an open section of fencing to watch more closely. Edmund called after her. She never heard him. Moments later frightened shouting erupted from deeper inside the preserve. A magnificent stag had become hopelessly tangled within broken fencing left damaged by illegal poachers several nights earlier. Twisted wire wrapped around its towering antlers while splintered timber trapped one foreleg. Terrified by approaching hunters attempting to help, the powerful animal thrashed violently, its enormous hooves striking frozen earth with explosive force. Villagers scattered. Children screamed. Several mounted guards raised rifles, fearing the stag would charge. Lucy stood frozen only yards away. "Don't shoot," Clara cried. Without waiting for permission, she climbed through the damaged fence. Alexander's heart nearly stopped. Every instinct urged him to pull her back. Instead he watched her walk slowly across the snow with empty hands visible beside her skirts. The stag lowered its antlers. Its breathing thundered through the silent forest. Another step. Then another. Clara stopped several feet away. Instead of speaking, she quietly began singing. The Christmas lullaby drifted gently across the winter air. Its familiar notes carried neither fear nor command, only calm. The animal's frantic movements gradually slowed. Its ears turned toward the melody. Its breathing softened. Snowflakes settled upon Clara's hair as she approached carefully enough to avoid startling the exhausted creature. With patient hands she loosened twisted wire from the antlers. She broke splintered wood away piece by piece. Finally the stag stood free. For one breathtaking moment it remained perfectly still. Its dark eyes rested upon Clara before it slowly stepped backward. A collective sigh spread through the watching crowd. Then disaster struck. The crashing sound came first. Branches exploded apart as another frightened stag burst from dense woodland, fleeing unseen hunters farther uphill. Unlike the first animal, this one ran blindly through panic, charging directly toward Lucy. The child stumbled backwards and fell. Alexander shouted her name. He began running. He knew he could never reach her in time. Clara did not hesitate. She threw herself across Lucy's small body, wrapping both arms around the terrified girl while turning her own back toward the charging animal. Everything seemed to stop. The stag leaped. Its enormous body soared over them with breathtaking power, missing Clara's head by scarcely more than inches before disappearing through drifting snow into the distant forest. Silence followed. Then Lucy began crying. Clara gently lifted the little girl into her arms. "You aren't hurt," she whispered. "I'm here." Alexander reached them moments later. His hands trembled so violently he could scarcely touch his daughter. Lucy clung to Clara before reaching for her father. "We're safe." Alexander looked at Clara. Not one word came. He had seen courage before. He had seen soldiers face cannon fire. He had seen noblemen defend honor in duels. None of it resembled what he had just witnessed. There had been no calculation, no audience, no hope of reward, only instinctive sacrifice, exactly as Eleanor would have chosen. That night Clara's fever returned after hours spent kneeling in snow. Mrs. Henshaw settled her into the tiny servant room beneath the attic stairs. Long after midnight, Alexander quietly entered carrying warm broth, fresh blankets, and evergreen branches fragrant with winter pine. He repaired the broken window latch himself to keep icy drafts outside before placing a small vase of white winter roses upon the bedside table. Clara never saw him arrive. She slept through the night while exhaustion claimed him beside her chair. When dawn's pale light slipped through the frosted window, Clara slowly opened her eyes and found Alexander asleep, one gloved hand still resting gently across hers as though unwilling to let courage disappear again. At that same moment, footsteps hurried along the corridor outside, and the estate's elderly music tutor stopped abruptly before Clara's open door, staring not at the sleeping Duke, but at the crushed silver bell resting upon the bedside table, his face draining of every trace of color. On Christmas Eve, a hush settled over Ashcroft Manor unlike any silence it had known during the previous 6 winters. It was no longer the silence of grief alone. It carried expectation, uncertainty, and the fragile hope that arrives only after sorrow has exhausted itself. Snow drifted gently beyond the tall windows while servants decorated the entrance hall with evergreen branches for the first time since Duchess Eleanor's death. No one had been ordered to do so. They simply had. Alexander watched quietly from the staircase, realizing the estate had begun healing without asking his permission. Clara's fever had broken before dawn, though weakness still lingered in her pale face. She insisted upon returning to her duties despite Mrs. Henshaw's stern objections. The elderly housekeeper finally surrendered, assigning her only light tasks inside the manor. Clara accepted gratefully, carrying fresh linens toward the old music room where Eleanor had once filled every Christmas with laughter. Before she reached the doorway, the estate's elderly music tutor, Professor Harold Pembroke, gently stopped her. His eyes remained fixed upon the crushed silver bell hanging once more around her neck. "May I examine it?" he asked quietly. Clara carefully untied the faded ribbon and placed the damaged keepsake into his weathered hands. Professor Pembroke had taught music at Ashcroft Manor for more than 40 years. He had instructed Alexander as a boy and later composed Christmas arrangements with Eleanor herself. His fingers, though aged, remained remarkably steady as they traced the engraved holly leaves surrounding the cracked bell. A faint look of astonishment crossed his face. "This isn't merely a bell." Alexander stepped closer. "What do you mean?" The old musician smiled sadly. Eleanor loved hiding little surprises inside musical gifts. He carefully turned the damaged ornament beneath the morning light. There, near the fractured seam rested a tiny groove invisible beneath years of tarnish. Using the point of a small tuning key from his waistcoat pocket, he gently pressed against it. The bell separated into 2 delicate halves. A tiny gasp escaped Lucy. Folded tightly inside rested a strip of yellowed parchment no larger than a child's finger. No one spoke. Professor Pembroke unfolded it with extraordinary care. Even before reading the words, Alexander recognized the graceful handwriting. His knees weakened. "Eleanor," he whispered. The professor handed him the fragile paper. Written in faded brown ink was only a single sentence. "If this reaches another lonely heart, Please love my family until they remember how to smile again. Alexander stared without blinking. The room blurred. He remembered watching Eleanor write Christmas messages for orphan children every December beside the library fire. She believed one kind sentence could outlive its author. She had been right. Edmund quietly covered his face. Lucy began crying openly before wrapping both arms around Clara's waist. "You found Mother's promise?" she whispered. "No," Clara answered softly, tears filling her own eyes. "Your mother found me." The servants standing outside the doorway lowered their heads in reverent silence. Mrs. Henshaw wiped away tears she had hidden for 6 long years. For the first time since Eleanor's death, grief no longer felt like an ending. It felt like an invitation. Later that afternoon, Professor Pembroke requested a private meeting with Alexander inside the Duke's study. "I've carried something too long," the old man confessed. Alexander looked up sharply. "What is it?" The professor placed an aged leather portfolio upon the desk. "I believe these were destroyed." Inside lay copies of official reports, handwritten testimonies, and sealed correspondence bearing government wax stamps. Alexander's hands trembled as he opened the first document. It described the fire that had consumed a roadside chapel 6 years earlier. The second listed the names of every orphan Eleanor had rescued. The third included sworn testimony from surviving villagers. None mentioned drowning. Every page told the same story. The Duchess had entered the burning chapel 5 separate times. Each time she emerged carrying another child. Each time witnesses begged her not to return. Yet she did. On the final rescue, the collapsing bell tower buried her beneath flaming beams before anyone could reach her. Alexander closed his eyes. The truth hurt far more beautifully than the lie. She had not died because fate failed her. She had died because love refused to abandon frightened children. "But why?" he whispered. "Was this hidden?" Professor Pembroke looked toward the window. "Because someone wanted it hidden." Within hours, Alexander quietly summoned surviving witnesses from neighboring villages. An elderly priest arrived carrying the chapel register. 3 grown men entered next, introducing themselves as former orphan boys Eleanor had carried from the flames. The last witness was an aging coachman who removed his cap before speaking. "It wasn't an accident, Your Grace. Someone collected every report. We were told never to speak publicly." Alexander's expression darkened. "Who?" The coachman hesitated. "Lady Margaret Winthrop." Silence crashed over the room. Lady Margaret. His own aunt. The woman who had spent years urging him toward another marriage. The woman who insisted Eleanor's memory prevented healing. The woman whose niece conveniently remained unmarried. Alexander ordered the Christmas Eve ball to proceed exactly as planned. When the grand ballroom filled with aristocrats beneath glittering chandeliers that evening, no one expected confrontation. Lady Margaret smiled confidently as guests admired her jeweled gown. Alexander stepped onto the marble dais. "I have hidden from Christmas long enough," he announced. The music ceased. He invited each witness forward. One by one they spoke. The priest described Eleanor's final prayer. The former orphans recounted being carried through smoke in her arms. The coachman revealed official orders suppressing the truth. Finally, Professor Pembroke presented Eleanor's hidden message. Every word echoed through the silent ballroom. Lady Margaret's composure collapsed. She admitted intercepting reports because a grieving duke had become easier to influence than a celebrated widower married forever to a national heroine. She believed controlling his future meant controlling Ashcroft influence. Gasps swept through the assembled nobility. Several ladies who had mocked Clara lowered their eyes in shame. Alexander removed Lady Margaret's family seal before every guest. "You buried my wife's courage," he said quietly. "You will never bury her honor again." No voice defended her. She walked from the ballroom alone. Then, before astonished nobles, Alexander crossed the polished floor toward Clara. He bowed his head. "Thank you," he said. "You reminded us who Eleanor truly was." Clara's eyes shimmered. "I only carried her song." Alexander answered gently. "And somehow, you carried Christmas home." At that very instant, a frightened stable boy burst through the ballroom doors, his face ghostly white as smoke drifted behind him from the eastern gardens, and with desperate breath he cried that the estate's ancient greenhouse was burning, while dozens of rare winter birds remained trapped inside. Smoke poured across the eastern gardens like a living storm, swallowing moonlight and staining the fresh snow with dark shadows. The ballroom's joyful murmurs vanished beneath frightened cries as guests rushed toward the towering windows. Orange flames flickered beyond the glass, climbing higher with every heartbeat. The ancient greenhouse, built nearly a century earlier from iron and crystal panes, had become a blazing furnace. The stable boy struggled to catch his breath. "The birds," he gasped. "Hundreds of them are trapped." Alexander needed no further explanation. He sprinted from the ballroom before anyone could stop him. His polished shoes slipped across the snow-covered stone paths as he raced toward the inferno. Behind him came servants carrying buckets, stable hands hauling ladders, and villagers who had gathered for the Christmas festivities. Yet no one reached the greenhouse before the Duke. The fire roared through the old cedar beams supporting the glass roof. Shattered panes exploded outward as unbearable heat met the freezing winter air. Inside, dozens of rare birds battered themselves against smoke-blackened windows, their desperate cries piercing the night with heartbreaking urgency. Alexander tore open the greenhouse doors. A wave of scorching heat struck him full in the face. Ignoring every warning shouted behind him, he disappeared into the smoke. "No!" Clara's voice broke through the chaos. Without hesitation, she seized a thick wool blanket, soaked it inside a horse trough, wrapped it around herself and followed him into the burning structure. Mrs. Henshaw screamed her name. Neither looked back. Inside, visibility vanished beneath thick smoke. Burning branches crashed from overhead as flames devoured hanging vines and ancient wooden shelves. Exotic birds fluttered wildly through the choking air, too terrified to find the open doorway. Alexander forced open one large aviary after another. Snow-white doves burst into the night. Golden pheasants followed. Brilliant finches escaped in glittering clouds of feathers. Still deeper inside, he heard Clara calling softly. "This way." She had reached the oldest enclosure, where injured birds spent the winter recovering beneath Eleanor's personal care years earlier. The iron latch had warped from intense heat. Alexander threw his shoulder against it once. Twice. The third impact shattered the lock. Dozens of frightened birds erupted around them, circling wildly before finding the open entrance. For one hopeful moment it seemed they might escape together. Then the ceiling groaned. A massive burning beam crashed downward. Alexander shoved Clara aside just before it struck. The timber slammed across his leg, pinning him beneath its crushing weight. Pain exploded through his body. Clara crawled back despite the falling embers. "You have to leave," Alexander shouted. She ignored him completely. The fire advanced around them. Another section of roof collapsed nearby. Burning glass showered across the stone floor. Outside, villagers watched helplessly. No one could safely enter anymore. Lucy buried her face against Edmund's shoulder. "They're still inside," she sobbed. Edmund gripped his father's old hunting knife until his hands shook. "They're coming back." He said it as a prayer. Inside the greenhouse, Clara searched desperately through smoke until she found a long iron cultivation bar lying beside overturned flower pots. She wedged it beneath the burning beam. The first attempt failed. The second barely lifted the weight. Her hands blistered instantly against the heated metal. She tightened her grip anyway. With every remaining ounce of strength, she pushed upward. The beam rose just enough. Alexander dragged himself free. Before Clara could move, the beam slipped. Alexander caught it with both arms. "Run." She refused. Together they lifted. Together they staggered toward the doorway. Another explosion shattered the remaining roof. Crystal glass rained down like deadly ice. Alexander instinctively pulled Clara against his chest, shielding her head and shoulders beneath his own body as fragments struck his coat and shoulders. They stumbled through the entrance only moments before the greenhouse collapsed completely behind them. A roar echoed across the gardens. Then silence. Snow continued falling. Every eye fixed upon the couple standing together in the drifting white. Alexander's dark coat smoked from scattered embers. Clara's hands were raw and trembling. Without thinking, Lucy raced forward first. She threw herself into Clara's arms. Edmund embraced his father. Neither child wanted to let go. Then something extraordinary happened. The rescued birds did not disappear into the night. Instead, hundreds of wings rose together above the burning ruins. They circled Ashcroft Manor once, twice, 3 times. Their graceful flight formed a shimmering ribbon beneath the softly falling snow before they settled peacefully throughout the surrounding gardens, rooftops, and ancient oak trees. No one spoke. Even the oldest villagers admitted they had never witnessed such a sight. Professor Pembroke smiled quietly through tears. Eleanor loved those birds. Mrs. Henshaw nodded. They remembered kindness. Alexander looked upward. For the first time in 6 years, he smiled without sorrow. The fire was eventually extinguished, though the greenhouse itself could not be saved. As dawn approached, Exhausted servants gathered inside the great hall wrapped in blankets, warming their hands around cups of steaming tea. No noble guest spoke of ruined property. Instead, every conversation centered upon courage. Lady Margaret's departure had already spread through the estate. Her lies had ended. Eleanor's truth remained. Later that evening, after the last frightened bird had been safely sheltered inside temporary wooden aviaries, Alexander asked Clara to meet him beneath the ancient cedar overlooking the frozen lake. It was the place where he had first confessed his love to Eleanor many years before. Moonlight rested softly upon fresh snow. Hundreds of candles lined the garden paths, their flames protected beneath crystal lanterns. Edmund and Lucy waited quietly beside Mrs. Henshaw at a respectful distance. Professor Pembroke stood holding Eleanor's restored music book. The servants formed a silent circle, not as witnesses to a duke's command, but to a family's healing. Alexander stepped toward Clara. His injured leg forced him to lean slightly upon a walking cane, yet his voice remained steady. I spent 6 years believing loving again would betray Eleanor. Clara lowered her eyes. I never wished to replace her. I know. He smiled gently. You never tried. He reached into his coat and removed the silver bell. The estate jeweler had worked through the afternoon repairing its shattered frame without erasing the fine cracks that told its story. Alexander tied it once more around Clara's neck using the same faded blue ribbon. It shouldn't be made perfect, he said softly. Some beautiful things deserve to remember they were once broken. Clara's tears finally escaped. Alexander continued. You reminded my children how to laugh. You reminded my servants how to hope. You reminded me that Eleanor's greatest gift was never the life she lived. He glanced toward the glowing manor. It was teaching others how to love after she was gone. Slowly he lowered himself onto one knee. Not with the dignity of a duke. Simply with the humility of a grateful man. He looked into Clara's tear-filled eyes. You never replaced Eleanor. You fulfilled the promise she left inside that little bell. He drew a simple ring from his pocket. Clara Whitmore. Will you let us spend every Christmas beside you? She covered her mouth as tears streamed freely down her face. For a long moment she could not speak. Finally she nodded. Yes. The single word seemed to warm the entire winter night. Lucy laughed through happy tears before throwing herself around Clara's waist. Edmund embraced them both. Mrs. Henshaw openly wept without embarrassment. Even the footmen applauded. Professor Pembroke quietly opened Eleanor's restored music book. Without instruction, he began playing the familiar Christmas lullaby upon a small travel violin. One servant joined the melody. Then another. Soon the villagers outside the gates recognized the tune. Voices drifted through the snowy darkness until the entire estate sang together. Alexander looked toward the stars above Ashcroft Manor. His voice barely rose above the music. You kept your promise, Eleanor. Months later, when another winter arrived, Ashcroft Manor no longer closed its gates at Christmas. Instead, one entire wing became known as the Christmas House, where widows found warmth, abandoned children found laughter, weary travelers found shelter, and no hungry soul was ever turned away. The rescued stag wandered peacefully through the gardens, approaching only Edmund, Lucy, and Clara, while the birds saved from the greenhouse nested freely among newly planted cedar trees. Every Christmas Eve, the restored bell rang across the valley, calling villagers not to mourn what had been lost, but to celebrate what love had preserved. As snow floated gently over the glowing estate, Alexander, Clara, Edmund, Lucy, the servants, and every guest joined hands beneath the winter sky and sang Eleanor's lullaby together, proving that the truest miracles are not those that erase grief, but those that transform it into kindness, courage, and a home where Christmas forever found every lonely heart.